My name is Petri Kero. I'm a CEO and one of the co-founders at Metaplay. I have like a bit more than 2 decades of experience in the software and games industries. I started at Hybrid Graphics, where we did a lot of like rendering graphics technology. That was ultimately acquired by NVIDIA, and it is still kind of the NVIDIA Helsinki office here in Helsinki or in Finland. And after that, I was a co-founder and CTO at another graphics technology company called Draw Elements. There we focus more on kind of quality and validation of the rendering hardware. So basically GPU testing and the kind of API testing, and that was ultimately acquired by Google, and it is nowadays the product is a happy part of the Android conformance test suite. So if you want to make like a valid Android device and get a stamp of approval on that, you will have to pass those tests that were developed at Draw Elements. And then after that, co-founder and CTO again, like at a company called Ministry of Games. So here we're doing a lot more, well, focusing on building actual games. And here is where I kind of ended up more focusing on the back end. And today, now happily working at Metaplay since roughly 4 years ago. So we're a fairly new startup and kind of combining all this experience from games and from software to make the basically next generation of like kind of how do you build mobile games, and especially the backend parts of that. So we are building this like platform for the most ambitious games, and the kind of target that we had is that what does it actually take in terms of backend technology to make a game that can really go into the top grossing charts, and what sorts of problems will you face, and how could we smoothen the way for all the game developers to get there. A little bit of kind of what is Metaplay, the product. Won't dive too deep into this, so you can check out our website if you're more interested. But just to get like a glimpse of it, at the beating heart of it is kind of the game server, which is essentially like a fully programmable engine that you can run your game logic on, and it comes with lots and lots of various features that you can do. So social gameplay, events, what have you, even up to some multiplayer stuff. Then on the client side, there's the kind of client SDK that you have to integrate, and this is what we use to maintain connectivity to the server and do lots of things like cheat-proof logic. And we also provide a whole lot of like kind of pre-built building blocks or kind of Lego blocks for building your own features. So for example, if you wanted to do in-game events, we can do a lot of the heavy lifting for you in terms of like scheduling and targeting and that sort of thing, and then leave it to the game developer to essentially just build the feature itself on top of our stuff, while still maintaining like a lot of flexibility in how to do that. And then on the other side, we have the LiveOps dashboard, which you can use to basically manage your game, do customer support, diagnose what's going on in the game, and this is useful for both the developers as well as designers of the game. And all this stuff runs then on top of like infrastructure. So this is what we use to basically deploy all the resources and provision them into the cloud. So in a very quick nutshell, that's kind of what we do. And then to the actual kind of meat of the talk. So all the projects, and especially games, this really applies to games, and maybe even more so the mobile free-to-play mobile games. So there's this huge tension of like, do I optimize now or do I optimize later? So it is usually very tempting to try to kind of skimp on things, do the very kind of minimal thing that you need to do right now, so that you can kind of get to the get your game out there into the market, and then figure it out later somehow, like how to do it properly. And since we are mostly talking in this talk about the kind of backend part of things, in terms of backend, it usually means like, hey, do I throw together this crappy thing right now out of some existing components, or do I actually go in there and invest into a proper one in the beginning, even though it kind of is fairly costly in terms of time and expertise and money as well. So let's go on a quick journey how this route might go for, say, a new game startup who wants to make a game like this. And again, like look at the kind of what does it mean in terms of the backend parts of that. So this is our goal. This is where we want to get. So we want to be successful, and we want our game to be at the top of the charts. So how do we get there? What does that even mean? So free to play. So usually like being at the top of the charts means that you need to be highly scalable. So we're now talking about hundreds of millions of players, maybe up to millions playing concurrently. So these are big systems that need to be highly scalable. And in terms of like kind of what do you need to reach to get those hundreds of millions of players, if we really kind of simplify this down to, even like oversimplify this, it can be split into basically high retention, so the players come back, and then high lifetime value. So you have to actually make money out of that, so that you can basically pay for user acquisition, which is how games are grown nowadays in the market. And again, like really oversimplifying, but the retention can be split into a couple of parts. So you need to usually have social features, be it guilds or other types of interaction, maybe even multiplayer between the players. You need to have a living world, so there it needs to progress somehow. Typically, you also need to have your own state as a player that progresses, so that you're kind of invested in the game, and you're going somewhere in that game. And then this content bonfire, content treadmill nowadays is kind of accepted that, hey, in order to bring the people back again and again, day after day, you just need to give them more experiences, more content, basically. And that gets expensive and hard to build. And then on the opposite side, how do you actually make money out of it? Couple of things highlighted here. So cheat proofing. So if you can just go and like use some hacking tools to actually get your max level heroes, max level buildings, whatever you have in the game, that's not going to be great for people. Incentivize them to pay money, so you need to protect against that. You need to have a great shop experience, so that the players are kind of again incentivized to purchase stuff. This usually means a lot of like personalization, a lot of offers, timed things, that sort of stuff. Kind of ties back to the content as well. So you need a lot of content to also monetize the players. So how would you actually go about building something like this? So if you do like a, even an MVP of what does it take to really like build a backend that can do the game that, or support a game that can really go up the charts. So first things first, like you obviously need like something online. So persistence, you need to keep your player state there. You need the server-side validation so that people cannot cheat. You need social gameplay, maybe even multiplayer. Essentially, all the games nowadays do have like components like this, so it's not probably something that you can skip on. You need to be able to update your game over the air, so that you can push new content down to the players quickly. And you need a lot of other tools like customer support tooling, live ops tooling, so that you can kind of keep the game fresh and personalized for the players. So how do we actually build this thing? What does it look like in practice? So it might be, if you build it properly, it might look something a little bit like this. Again, like highly simplified version of, say, a modern backend stack. So there on the top, you have this fully scalable or highly scalable, fully distributed system of, hey, you need to run your game logic somewhere, multiplayer stuff somewhere. You have some load balancer in the front, CDN to deliver all the data to the players, various kinds of game services, so you can do the in-apps, push notifications, what have you, and you need like a highly scalable database layer as well there. But even that is not enough, so you need a whole lot of kind of supporting systems. So you need to provision the stuff somehow, have the CI/CD pipeline so that you can push out new builds. You need to have some sort of dashboard where you can kind of manage the game, and you need a whole host of kind of visibility into the game, so analytics, logging, metrics, that sort of monitoring stuff. And these would be more for the team to kind of figure out what's going on in the game and kind of how to update it and make it better. And this is really just kind of the starting point of kind of minimum really viable thing that you need to do. And there's a lot of hidden complexity beneath it also. There's just a couple of things mentioned there. So it really gets complicated, and it's a lot of work. And our estimate, based on having been building these systems, is that we are talking somewhere in the ballpark of 4 years, 4 person years at the minimum to get something like this, even an MVP of a scalable backend stack out there into a game. And for example, our product now has probably more than 2 person decades of development behind it, and we are very far still from being anywhere near complete. So, and now we're again like just talking about the backend part. Then there's the whole other part, the game and everything else that you need to also be building. And to add insult to the injury, like you still need to start small, and we are a small startup, making this stuff. And some of the competition already has like well over a decade of kind of track record of making these things, and like kind of basically head start on you. So doesn't really sound very fair, and it really isn't very fair. Life isn't. So what if we take another look at this? Again, how do we actually like look at this from the business side of things? So how does the typical business plan of a mobile gaming startup look like nowadays. So again, oversimplifying greatly, but I think this still is surprisingly truthful way of how gaming companies think about the business nowadays. So what you do there is that you make a small game, the game that you always wanted to build. You push it out into the market. You prove the metrics, so you get the retention and you get the monetization ROAS metrics. Whatever is the metric of the day that investors want to see. Then you go and raise a lot more money. Usually in the, I don't know, 5+ million at this stage if you manage to make it big, like a game that really has the potential. But then you hit like a potential roadblock, like, hey, we really made it fast and scrappy, so now we actually need to make the game for real now that we know that there is a lot of potential and there's a lot of traction there. And then somehow you end up as part of the previous slides, like big boys in the industry. So if you look at this again, like what does this mean in terms of like how can we translate this into a more practical setup? So we can split this into two parts. So get to the data. So we need the data like the metrics and monetization, and we really want to do this quick and cheap because you only have so much money after your, say, initial raise of funding. And to get the data, we obviously need the game itself, so core gameplay, we need to launch it, and then we need analytics, how we actually measure those numbers. And we really want to do this quick and cheap, so we will try to be as fast with the iteration speeds as possible. We will focus, so we will not do anything extra that we don't need to get to these numbers. And we will use as much familiar technology as we possibly can so that we can, again, just be as fast as possible with this. And again, like it might look a little bit something like this. So we do a lot of development in the Unity editor so that we can iterate fast. Maybe we'll completely fake the multiplayer or do some very, very minimal thing using some off-the-shelf building blocks that you can find. Then you need to have purchases so that you can get the analytics and the analytics pipeline itself. But on the plus side, you do get actually some wiggle room that bigger games don't. So you can actually go back and reset the whole game data because you only had like a couple of thousand players there. So it's live. And again, like you don't need to do anything extra because you're just out there to prove the numbers, and you don't need to talk about or implement any of the customer service systems, for example. So now we are here, which is a considerably simpler way of implementing this, and maybe like most significantly, there is no scalability issue solved here. So you can just run this on a single box in the cloud, and everything will be fine. Or you can maybe even utilize managed services for more or less all of this, and then not have to actually own any of your own infrastructure. So that doesn't sound too bad. Something like this you could probably throw together in like, I don't know, some weeks, maybe a couple of months or something like that. Sounds very kind of doable for a new startup, just proving out the game, like whether it actually works or not. But it's actually a great idea for all the games that don't actually end up succeeding. So if the game fails, you kind of minimize the investments that you put into that product, and all is great. But then you're going to hit a whole lot of roadblocks in case you start getting traction on the market and your game is a potential next hit game. And that's where the needs of the product really start evolving, and kind of you need to add a lot more stuff on top of that. Again, like going a bit more concrete, so we're kind of seeing the same blocks here. So yeah, offline development, managed deployment, so that we don't need to worry about that analytics. And we're all doing this all on the cheap, as well as maybe even using some pre-made game features. So maybe you'll find some sort of guild implementation somewhere out there that you can kind of fit into your game, and then be happy and ship fast with that. But then once you get the traction, suddenly you get a whole lot more requirements on the backend side. So for example, we talked about this earlier, cheat proofing, multiple deployments so that you can actually test stuff in development environments before you push them live into the players, so that you don't mess up the game. Just 100x scalability, but it could actually be 1000x or 10,000x scalability if you go from 10,000 players to tens of millions or 100 million players. You'll obviously need to reach basically feature parity with the rest of the competition on the market. A lot of work there, and indeed customer support, localization, DevOps tooling, all that stuff we talked about earlier. And at this stage, usually like the team of the behind the game and the backend is also growing. So you need to start taking it a bit more seriously in terms of like documenting everything so that you can onboard new members onto the team and and so on. And then if we go even further, just more and more features will be, or requirements will be added. To name a couple from there, so now, for example, you probably really want to be self-hosting your servers, in the sense that you don't want to trust managed services really, because your business continuity, your like 100 million, I don't know, 500 million business is relying on some external party. But you really would like to own that data so that there is no issues if they happen to pivot or do something else or so on. You might start actually getting other game projects in your company that they want to reuse the same technology. So again, this kind of makes it a real, more mature software project that you need to take into account things like testing, maintenance. There will probably be further like custom integration. So I don't know, maybe the marketing people on the team feel like, hey, we want to be running some sort of player profiling analysis, which you now need to then maybe integrate third-party services into. So you really need a good amount of flexibility from the backend technology so that you can do all of this. But on the plus side, you actually lose some of the requirements along the way. So you don't want to be using those managed deployments anymore. You don't need to be cheap anymore, because now you gain traction. So you actually were able to raise that 5 million round funding or 10 million or whatever. But then, your game will probably, as it grows older and more complex, will require needing some very customized special features that only apply to your game. So you're kind of out of luck with any sort of black box technologies that otherwise maybe were good in the beginning of the project. So the features of those just aren't good enough anymore for you. You need more flexibility. So how does one address this? Like, how do you move fast today without kind of slowing yourself or bogging yourself really badly down at the point when you do get that point that, hey, we are getting traction with the game, while still not investing a huge amount of time and money beforehand, before you know that you actually have that success on your hands. So the first life hack, consider now, implement later. So essentially be smart about things and then plan for the future. And one example that we, for example, do, and this could be done anywhere else as well, but we are using this pattern called command pattern. And what it means essentially is that you try to isolate all the actions that the player can make into these individual blobs that you can then transfer over to the server, where they can be validated that, hey, this is actually a legal thing that the player can do. And therefore you can actually have the server be the full authority over the game state. So now it suddenly doesn't matter at all what the client thinks that the game state is about, because the server will always be the ultimate authority. But this sounds like quite a bit of work, and it actually is. But you can be smart about it today. Maybe you just implement this. So basically decouple the logic and the visualization layer on the client side, and essentially leave it at that. So you use this command pattern on the client, and you don't implement the server stuff yet, but you just leave that for later. So if the game gets traction, then you go back and implement that stuff, while you don't have to kind of go refactoring or kind of rewriting the game logic that you already have, but rather some part of the team can keep on developing the game, while another part of the team just goes and implements all this backend stuff for the validation. So being future-proof does not mean that you need to be slow as well. So you can be smart about this stuff. And indeed, like the quote goes to essentially say, in the gaming world, it is unfortunately quite an often seen pattern that a lot of the game logic code gets really tangled up with, for example, the UI code or something like that. Very common to see. And if you kind of end up on that path, then it can be quite the undertaking to actually go back and refactor and your game to be able to support something like the command pattern or whatever validation you want to be using with the server. So think ahead before going and writing things. The second big thing that we found to be really big impact is implementing like a custom data pipeline for your game. So modern games, mobile ones, probably others as well, tend to have a ton of data running them. So you have a lot of economy data, your item levels, what have you, all your events, all your offers, that kind of stuff, maybe levels as well. We've seen projects where this grows even to the, I don't know, 10 megabytes and beyond. and there can be like 50 or 100 sheets in a spreadsheet where all this data is defined. So this really tends to grow big, and there aren't any kind of one size fits all answers here, because there tends to be usually with each game like some unique aspects that they will need to like kind of or want to specify the data in ways that aren't really like done in other games. So how would you approach this? So the first step is basically to model your data. Usually we find that most of this sort of economy data tends to fit very well into a spreadsheet form. So you could, for example, use Google Sheets. Some people like using Excel and then sharing the files. Many tools there available. But indeed, like if you have like, I don't know, 20 different levels of an item, you can easily express them as rows in the sheet, where each of the column is then like some sort of property of that particular item level. And usually, like if you have multiple categories of data, you can express that as different sheets in the sort of different tabs in the sheet. And then any properties that you have, they can be like columns of the sheets. But there are other things that you want to think about. So data types. Also, maybe you want to generate some data. So oftentimes, say balancing information is actually computed out from some sort of formula, so that, hey, my level 5 item should have these types of properties in general, this many hit points, whatever. The designers really usually like working with spreadsheet tools because they allow a lot of flexibility in this area. And similarly, you might want to visualize that data as well, power curves or cost curves, or how much does it cost to buy everything in the game and that sort of thing. And spreadsheets, again, great tooling for that, and you don't need to build anything yourself. Just go to sheets.google.com and you'll be good to go. And one more emphasis here is that this stuff should really be designed for the kind of economy or game designer of the game. So their needs should be driving kind of the structure of the data and how it's edited, because you want them to be able to edit the thing smoothly, and it should be intuitive and fast to change and iterate on. But still, that's not enough. So obviously, like once you have, especially the more complex the game gets, the more complex the data as well is or becomes. And it is very easy to, if you have 50 sheets, it is very easy to make accidental mistakes there. So you want like have a really like kind of solid layer of validation on your data as well. So get rid of any conflicting entries. Check that if you have references from one sheet to another, that the references are actually valid, the other item actually exists there. Don't reuse old IDs. Make sure that you don't actually end up kind of changing the IDs of existing things, and so on and so on. And again, here, as the game grows, becomes more complicated, the validation needs also become more complicated. And one especially hard thing is actually like kind of removing old data. So the stuff that is in your game economy, you just can't go and remove something from there, because you might actually have player states in your database that are still like they own the item. So you need to figure out how do you actually then essentially kind of purge those items if you want to remove them, or maybe convert them into other resources or whatever you want to do. So that's a surprisingly tricky problem to solve. And again, like this goes back to the point that games will have unique requirements for the data. So one of the features that we have, for example, seen used a lot and we support as well is this sort of advanced parsing, where you can figure out your own like formats, like, hey, maybe your rewards can be given out with some syntax like 12 gold, some common and some rare items, which then get randomized, and that sort of thing, or 3-star pets that you give out. And while this quote mostly applies or has been written about computer code, I strongly believe that it actually applies to data as well. So as I said, like if you have 50 sheets of Google data there, potentially thousands and thousands of rows, you really don't want that to end up being like a spaghetti that nobody understands, but it should be well structured and well understandable for everybody working on the project. And maybe to summarize this really is like one of the biggest wins that we have seen some game developers get by basically investing in some amount of this tooling very early in the project, and then using it from the very get-go, getting like a very flexible data-driven game as a result, where the designers have a huge amount of flexibility to change anything that they want, without kind of needing to talk and kind of waiting for the programmers to actually implement this. So it can really speed up your iteration cycles for the game. And then last one, always have an upgrade path. So a bit similar to the first one, slightly different angle here. It's a great quote from some anonymous founder, but indeed, when your game does start getting traction, the problem tend to shift a lot. So in the beginning, you really didn't have any money and you needed to kind of still put the whole thing together. And now suddenly you're in a place where you have all the money that you need. But now you might be faced with in the worst case, something that you need to completely re-architect the whole backend that you were using in the first stage, and no amount of money will solve this in a short amount of time. So there is just some amount of like kind of calendar months that you absolutely need, even if you had all the resources, all the people in the world to build that stuff. And really, hope is not a plan. So do think about this stuff before, as opposed to when you're gonna end up in this situation. How will you actually deal with the hopeful eventuality that your game does actually become the next big hit, and you really don't at that stage want to be bogged down, implementing all of these features that will be required from you. So another example here, like how do you actually then do the game configs? So the very simplest version is that you just hard code everything into the code. So it doesn't really get any simpler than that. So there's essentially, you could say that there's no setup or extra work to get that stuff done. But on the flip side, whenever you want to update your game, live game, you will have to make a new build and distribute it. Your designers will not be very happy campers. Like if you tell them to, hey, just go change the code directly, they don't really know. They're not happy in that environment. And especially with any kind of bigger team, this is a complete non-starter. So the next step iteration from that might be something like, hey, let's just put all of that stuff into JSON file and then upload it to server. Hey, that sounds good, right? The upsides there, again, easy setup. You maybe need some S3 bucket somewhere and then like just or use Google Drive or something like that, where you just push the files and be done with that. And JSON is like a pretty reasonable format in many ways to use to send over and so forth, to parse. But big downsides here as well. So JSON is really slow to parse. So we have seen cases where like when you have like 10 megabytes of JSON, it can actually start taking tens of seconds on a low spec Android device to actually go through all the data and then parse it. Same thing with like network bandwidth. So you're actually paying for that transmission of that data, so it doesn't really pan out on a larger scale. And still, your designers are not going to be very happy. They're not really like kind of JSON experts, and it is still a fairly technical format to use. And then there's all the other like kind of complicated things like how do you version this stuff, how do you def it, roll it back if something went wrong, A/B testing. So there's a lot of issues still with that kind of approach. So how do we do it then? So essentially, what we do is that we allow the designers to work in a tool where they are much more familiar. Most of the time, this happens to be spreadsheets, but it could also be any other format. For example, some custom level editor or something like that. And then we have a very separate, like specific build step where we can also do all the validation, that we can kind of check that all the data as a whole, all the references or whatnot are still intact. Do any kind of validation that makes sense for a particular game, maybe even to the point that, hey, you figure out like that, there are no items are not too cheap or something like that, that there are no easy ways to hack the game economy by, I don't know, buying something that was by accident 10x too cheap. So upsides here would be great workflow. So you actually do get the tools that you want to use. We're using binary formats that are kind of customized for this sort of purpose. So you get, I don't know, at least 10 times faster parsing, probably, maybe even more. Same for the transmission. It's faster and costs you less. Very customizable as the game grows. So very flexible format. But the big downside is that while we can handle a lot of the kind of setup work for you, it is still a pretty complicated piece to set all of this stuff up. So spreadsheet, build pipelines, parsing, validation, what have you. So we can actually be a bit simpler about this in the beginning. So what we can do is that we can still utilize the same tooling and just skip the kind of server from the middle in the beginning. So we can just use the same tools and then make a build, or even go as far as just declare all that stuff hard code into the code, but have the structures ready that you can just kind of lift and shift the whole game config package out from there into the tools that you want to use. So here again, like we get this kind of best of both world approach that very simple to start with. You do have the path, the future-proof path of kind of growing out of it, and as a big upside is that like when you're most pressed for kind of to deliver those features, you don't need to go back and do a lot of refactoring on the code. So highly recommend doing something like that. So just to recap, so first things first, like consider now, implement later. So do make it easy for your future self to actually kind of work on the project. Should you actually be in the happy group that does get that traction? Do customize your data pipeline for the game that you're making. Really big benefits there. And do plan for kind of how do you actually upgrade out of the tooling that you have right now when the team grows by 2x, 3x, and you really cannot be using those approaches anymore. So indeed, you don't need to get bogged down. You can actually be smart about this fundamental tension and be smart about optimize a little bit now and leave most of it for the later. So if this sort of thing kind of is something that you fancy doing, the good news is that we are hiring. So we have a booth out there. So come talk to me or one of my colleagues over there, and we'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have. So thank you.